Now that I've routed the top to the shape of the body, I'm pretty pleased with the result. The sunlight is really streaming in here, so you can't quite see the colour. But it looks really nice. There are a couple of small flaws, some of which could, in the long run, be beneficial. There must have been some warping to this top, because I see that in clamping it down and gluing it, a split has come up just here. And there is one there that became evident to me when I began clamping it down on the body. Now, I'm not too worried about those. I'm going to give this top a bit of a sand so that there won't be such a ridge there. That'll be barely noticeable. And before I put any top coat on, I'm going to use a process called grain filling. And you'll see more about that later. But basically, when I grain fill, those lines can actually be... Well, that one you won't see much of because the pickup cavity will go there and there'll be another one there. So I may even obscure that entirely. But it will make those lines possibly a source of really nice character. We'll see how that goes. I'm cutting the binding channel into the body of this guitar now. And I thought I should demonstrate something here. One of the challenges of binding a body where the neck can't be removed, like in a neck-through construction, is that you're resting the router base on the body of the guitar and sliding it around, but you're going to bump into the fretboard. And so there are various ways that people try to get around this quite successfully. Here's my way. I've just got another fretboard because I haven't started thinning this down or radiusing it yet. And obviously that's true of this fretboard that I haven't used, and I won't be using it because there is some damage to it. So I've just clamped that down next to this one so that the router base can now sit on these two and slide around. So I cut the binding channel until about there, and then I readjusted the depth of the bit and sat the router on here so that I could continue all the way up to the neck. I've just lightly, very, very lightly grazed the binding there, which is not great. I should be able to scrape that out though, that is so light. And I'll use the same method over the other side as well. Had a slight mishap here, because when you're doing this, of course, when you've got the router sitting on these, you've got the bit lowered a little bit more, and I accidentally leaned the router over and did a cut there, making that slightly deeper, but that's okay. The reason that's okay is that the outermost layer of binding, which is white, is going to be taller than the other two. It's still coming to me in the mail, and it's going to be taller, so I'm going to have to cut a taller outer step in there anyway, so I'm not really worried about that. That's going to be a non-existent issue. Initially, I looked at the bit and the bearing combination and thought that was a depth that would cut enough for 2 layers of binding, but actually, looking at it again, I think it's even deeper than that. I didn't check it correctly. That's deep enough for 3 layers of binding, which is no trouble. 3 looks good, so it'll go white, black, white. I now have my extra tall binding, which will be the outermost layer in the binding on this guitar. So what I need to do now is cut an extra step into this binding channel to accommodate the taller binding on the outside. So I've just put a different rebate cutter or rabbit cutter, depends on which country you're in, onto the router, deep enough to cut for 1 layer of binding, and that will cut into the edge just below where the existing channel is. I'll show you what I mean. Bring you over here and show you what I've just done. So there's the existing binding channel, and there's a channel within the channel. So the 2 shorter strips will sit in there, and the taller one will sit on the outside. So I'll just go around the whole body and do that. So here I am binding away. There's the binding that I put on last night. A bit messy, but that's okay. It's going to be cleaned up. And I'm just noticing that the binding channel is just a tiny little bit taller or deeper. Taller, I'll say. I'll use depth to refer to the measurement in that direction and height to refer to the measurement in that direction. The binding channel is just a smidge taller than the binding, less than a millimeter. So what am I going to do there? I guess just through a combination of sanding and scraping, I will bring those edges down level with the binding. It's a very small amount, so it shouldn't be too difficult. Okay, so for the most part, I'm using what I normally use for binding, acetone, which makes things melt and stick nicely. That works best on the convex curves, the outside curves, but for inside curves, for the concave ones, it's more challenging to get the binding to stick. Because with a convex curve, you can secure it there and hold the binding on tight as it's drying, and that works okay. It's not so easy in that direction. So for the binding on the inside curves, where I need to, I'm using Weld-On, which is widely recommended by luthiers for plastic binding, and it works well. It is a bit messy, as you can see. That's quite mucky, but you know, that will scrape up all right. So I will just proceed now to finish the innermost layer of cream and then move on to the black and then the extra tall binding on the outside. Actually, before I continue with any other binding, I am sanding using, what is that? It's quite rough paper. Is it 80 maybe? Maybe. Sanding the edge of the body just so that it's level with the binding, and then I'll continue with the binding. So I'm done with the black layer now. That was a piece of cake. I'm on to the final layer, which is an extra tall strip of cream binding. It's perhaps a little more challenging, but it's not too bad. It's more challenging mostly in the sense that it's more difficult to bend because there's more of it. So what I did, for example, with that piece, and what I think, what I'm quite sure I will have to do for that part as well, is I took the strip of binding inside, turned the kettle on, and filled a cup of boiling water, and dipped the end in, left it there for about a minute, and then took it out and just wrapped that end around, whatever was handy. Actually, I used the wooden handle of a serving spoon, but yeah, you can use whatever you like. And that seemed to work fine. Because it is tall and there's a larger surface to attach, I am putting in more acetone. I'm finding not too much trouble with the acetone. Once you've got a layer of PVC binding on already, acetone works much better because it melts both surfaces. But as I say, I'm putting in a bit more acetone because of the height of this binding. Probably a little bit too much. It's getting quite mucky. I mean, I can scrape the binding and scrape and sand the wood. Gosh, planes are loud. And hopefully get that looking all nice and clean. It looks terrible just now, but you know, this is the workbench. Give it time. So, it's going well though. It looks like it's going fine. The glue is still drying on the final piece of binding over here. But all the rest of it was done some time ago. So now I'm just taking standard wood scraper and I'm scraping, basically scraping the wood, and thereby in the process scraping the binding down to the level of the wood. In particular that last strip, which is much taller than the others. And it's coming up pretty well. Pretty well indeed. So that's just the effect that I was going for. So this, you know, it's a success in terms of getting the job done, but it is really messy. So I'm just going to do a whole lot of scraping now. Firstly, scraping the binding pretty much level, and then scraping and sanding around the edges of the body as necessary to clean it up. Back soon. So with all 3 layers now on, and with the binding scraped pretty much to the level of the top all the way around, that looks pretty good. I mean, there are some areas that feel a little bit rough and look not perfect yet. I'll do a little more spot scraping and maybe some very fine sanding. But basically, the binding's done. I spotted one thing that's not ideal. When you put binding around a body or around anything, there'll be an edge there because the binding will overhang very, very slightly. Unless you've got things terribly wrong and the wood is overhanging, then you're in trouble. But the binding, in my case, overhang just a little. So what you do is you take your scraper and you scrape the wood around the edge, thereby scraping the binding at the same time. And what that results in is the binding is now flush with the edge of the body. Great, just what you want. I did it up here where, because I had tweaked this cutaway and I used the spindle sander to tweak it, and when it came off the sander, it came off with a wave, humps along the surface. And I thought, well, I'll just live with that. Maybe I shouldn't have thought that, because now when I've scraped the binding level with the surface of the wood, those same humps, those same waves are of course just translated onto the binding. So now my binding is shaped the same way as that wavy wood, which isn't really perfect, but it's, how terrible is it? I don't know. It's not ideal, but I can't really do anything about that now, short of things that would be onerous, like ripping that binding out completely, resanding that curve without the waves, and then rebinding it. I could do that. I so don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Even as I was describing the solution to the wavy surface of the cutaway there and saying, I really don't want to do that, I was saying to myself, yeah, but you do have to. I wouldn't have been happy with the binding not looking right. So what I've done is I've taken the template that I originally routed the shape of the guitar body from, and although I have adjusted the curve on the cutaway, there is at least a section of the curve on here that would be quite acceptable. So what I've done is clamped the template so that that curve that I would be happy with allows me to route away that part of the curve that I'm not happy with because it's wavy on the surface. So I'm just going to route that out. Then I will remove that binding carefully, rebind it, tidy it up, and we'll be back in business. After routing it, I took it over to the spindle sander and sanded it carefully, making sure that any waves that existed after sanding were then sanded out. And I've checked that the curve is now good. But of course, as you can see, I have removed some of the binding. So I'm going to have to properly remove that binding and route out the channel again so that I can rebind it. And there it is, as though it had never been bound. I just took a chisel and cut out the binding. There was a small amount of breakage to the surface of the wood. That proved not to be too much of a problem though, because I was, after all, then sanding the surface back a little and then routing the channels again, which meant that they were deeper than last time, so that I ended up cutting out any superficial damage. It may even look a little bit neater than last time I did this. Maybe I'm getting better at it. Done, and that went quite well. There's no longer a wave on that surface, just as I would want. The only tiny flaw was difficult to avoid. When I first put the binding on, I put the first layer of white all around the body, and then the first layer of black all around the body, so I could make the black meet it at the corner there, and ditto for the outer layer. But of course, when I took this off, I took all 3 strips off at once, so the corner was then cut like so. So it was difficult to make the colours meet. What I had to do, well, that white one could meet easily, but then, of course, when the black one was on, there was a gap there. When I put that black one in, I had to then insert a tiny bit of black there, and similarly when I put the white binding or the cream binding, there was a gap there, so I had to insert a piece of cream binding. That's gone quite well. It's just that the black is slightly jagged now, but quite tolerable indeed.